There is a moment that happens to almost everyone, usually late at night, when the house is quiet and the noise of the day has finally settled. You lie there, and a quiet voice starts comparing. It measures your career against someone else's. It measures your body, your bank account, your marriage, your children, your face in the mirror, against a version of someone else that you barely know. And somehow, in that comparison, you always come up short. You tell yourself you are being humble. You tell yourself you are simply being realistic. But underneath it, something else is happening. You are quietly agreeing to be less than you are. You are handing your sense of worth over to people who never asked for that responsibility, and who could not carry it even if they wanted to. That handover happens so quietly that most people never even notice they have done it, and yet it shapes almost every decision that follows. This happens so often that most people never notice it as a pattern. It feels like an isolated thought, a passing insecurity, nothing more, but it repeats. It shows up when a colleague gets praised in a meeting and you feel your stomach tighten. It shows up when an old classmate posts a photo of a life that looks shinier than yours. It shows up in the pause before you speak in a room full of people, and when you quietly decide your opinion matters less than everyone else's. And over years, this habit does something corrosive. It teaches your nervous system that your value is conditional, that it depends on winning some invisible contest against people who are not even competing with you. And so you shrink. Not all at once, but in small increments, until shrinking simply feels like who you are. You stop raising your hand. You stop applying. You stop believing your voice belongs in the room. What makes this so difficult to catch is that comparison rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as ambition, as self-improvement, as simply wanting to do better. But there is a clear difference between wanting to grow because growth genuinely matters to you and wanting to grow only so you can finally feel equal to someone else. The first comes from a place of curiosity and purpose. The second comes from a wound that keeps reopening no matter how much you achieve, because the goalpost always moves the moment you get close to it. Someone else always seems to be a step ahead, and so the chase never actually ends, because it was never really about the destination. It was about trying to silence a feeling of not being enough, using outside proof that was never going to be strong enough to reach the place where the feeling actually lives. Consider something as ordinary as walking into a family gathering after a difficult year. Before you have said a single word, some part of you is already calculating how your year measures up against everyone else's. You notice who bought a house, who got promoted, who seems happier in their marriage. And without meaning to, you place yourself somewhere on that invisible ladder. If you land near the bottom of your own private ranking, the rest of the evening feels heavier, even if nothing outwardly bad happens. You laugh a little less freely. You share a little less honestly. This is not because your year was actually a failure. It is because you walked in already measuring yourself against a scale that had nothing to do with your actual life, your actual effort, or your actual growth. The central shift this video is built around is simple to say and difficult to live. Your worth was never meant to be measured against another person. It was never a contest to begin with. The ancient Stoics did not teach that you should think of yourself as superior to others in status, wealth, or achievement. That would only be trading one form of comparison for another, simply moving your identity to the opposite end of the same broken scale. What they taught was something quieter and far more useful. They taught that your character, your effort, your integrity, and your inner steadiness belong entirely to you, and that no other human being can raise or lower their value. When you stop needing to be better than someone else, and instead focus completely on being fully yourself, something strange happens. You stop feeling small, not because you have decided you are the best, but because the entire scale you were measuring yourself on quietly disappears. And once it disappears, there is nothing left to lose. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, not to an audience, in the quiet hours of long military campaigns. And one of the ideas he returned to again and again was that other people's seminal opinions of him were not his responsibility to manage. He held one of the most powerful positions in the ancient world, surrounded by flatterers and critics alike, and he understood that if he let either group determine his sense of self, he would never have a self at all. He reminded himself, night after night, that his task was to act with reason and decency, regardless of how he was perceived. This was not arrogance. It was the opposite of arrogance. It was a refusal to let his identity be rented out to strangers who had no real stake in his perceived, only in what they could gain by praising or criticizing him. He understood that a mind constantly checking the crowd for approval would never be steady, enough to lead, let alone to live well. Epictetus, who had been born into slavery and later became one of the most respected teachers in Rome, built an entire philosophy around a single distinction. Some things are within your control, and some things are not. Your reputation, other people's approval, the way you are ranked against your peers, all of that lives outside your control. What lives inside your control is your judgment, your effort, your response. He taught his students that suffering usually comes not from events themselves, but from the meaning we attach to them. When you stop attaching your worth to comparison, the comparison loses its grip on you, not because you have won it, but because you have quietly walked out of the game entirely. He often reminded his students that a person who has learned to separate what belongs to them from what does not is nearly impossible to insult, because there is nothing left for an insult to grab onto. Diogenes of Sinope took this even further, in a way that is almost uncomfortable to consider today. He lived with almost nothing, deliberately, and openly questioned the idea that status or wealth made one person more valuable than another. There is a well-known story, passed down through later writers, that when a powerful ruler once stood before him and offered to grant him any favor, Diogenes simply asked him to step out of his light. He was not trying to be clever for its own sake. He was demonstrating, with his whole life, that dignity does not require anyone else's permission or approval. His example is extreme, and most people would not want to live exactly as he did, but the core insight remains valuable. The moment you stop performing for approval, you become remarkably difficult to diminish, because there is nothing being offered that you feel you desperately need. Seneca, who advised one of Rome's most unstable emperors while quietly writing some of the most enduring reflections on human nature, understood something particularly relevant to modern life. He observed that people often measure their lives not against their own values, but against whoever happens to be nearby, and that this habit alone was enough to make even a fortunate life feel inadequate. He noticed that no matter how much a person gained, there was always someone positioned slightly ahead, and if a person built their peace of mind on closing that gap, they would spend their entire life exhausted and never once satisfied. His advice was not to stop striving. It was to strive according to your own reasoned judgment of what mattered, rather than according to a shifting hierarchy built entirely out of other people's and circumstances. Centuries later, the psychologist Alfred Adler studied something he called the inferiority complex, the sense many people carry that they are fundamentally not enough compared to others. He noticed that this feeling often begins early in life, in childhood comparisons between siblings, classmates, or the general expectations placed on us by family. Adler observed that people often spend their entire lives either hiding this feeling or overcompensating for it, chasing achievement not because they want it, but because they hope it will finally prove their worth to an audience that was never actually watching that closely. His work suggested something freeing. The goal was never to become superior to others. It was to grow toward your own potential, guided by contribution and personal growth rather than by comparison. He believed that a person who redirected their energy away from proving themselves and toward genuinely useful, meaningful work would naturally find a steadier and more lasting sense of worth. The psychologist Carl Rogers, working decades after Adler, arrived at a related conclusion from a different direction. Rogers spent much of his career studying why some people grow into secure, well-adjusted adults while others remain anxious and self-doubting no matter what they accomplish. He concluded that a stable sense of self tends to develop when a person receives what he called unconditional positive regard, the experience of being valued simply for existing, rather than valued only when performing, achieving, or winning approval. When that kind of steady regard is missing, a person can spend a lifetime chasing conditions they believe will finally earn it: more success, more recognition, more proof. Rogers's insight suggests something you can offer yourself even later in life: the same unconditional regard you may not have received from every person around you. You do not need someone else's. This permission to finally consider your own existence worthy of respect. Understanding the psychology behind this pattern helps explain why it is so persistent. Human beings evolved in small groups where social standing genuinely affected survival. Being seen as less capable, less attractive, or less valuable than others in the tribe carried real consequences. Sometimes the difference between belonging and being cast out entirely. That wiring did not disappear simply because modern life changed. Your mind still scans rooms for where you rank. It still tightens when someone appears to be ahead of you. This is not a personal flaw. It is an old survival mechanism firing in a modern context, where it usually does more harm than good. since your actual survival no longer depends on winning social comparisons with coworkers, neighbors, or strangers online. Recognizing this can soften the shame that often comes with comparison. You are not weak for feeling it. You are human, running very old software in a world it was never built for. There is also a subtler psychological pattern worth naming here, one connected to attention itself. Whatever you repeatedly give your attention to becomes the lens through which you interpret everything else. If your attention habitually drifts toward what others have and what you lack, your mind will keep gathering evidence to support that story, filtering out anything that might contradict it. This is not a conscious choice most of the time. It becomes automatic, almost invisible, which is exactly why it feels so believable. The good news is that attention can be redirected with practice. It does not happen through willpower alone, forcing yourself to simply stop noticing. It happens through consistently offering your mind a different question to focus on, one rooted in your own effort and values rather than in someone else's results. Over time, the old lens weakens, not because you fought it directly, but because you stopped feeding it. The psychologist Leon Festinger described this tendency directly in what he called social comparison, the idea that people naturally evaluate their own abilities and opinions by measuring themselves against others, especially when no objective standard is available. Festinger's research suggested that this instinct is not inherently harmful, and it becomes harmful mainly when the comparison is constant, one-directional, and aimed at people whose circumstances are so different from your own that the comparison was never fair to compare with. Not comparing your 5th year of a new career to someone else's, his 20th year in an established one is not honest measurement. It is simply a way of manufacturing disappointment. Recognizing this does not mean comparison itself is the enemy. It means learning to notice when a comparison is actually useful information and when it is only a distorted mirror. Here is a small exercise you can begin today, and it takes only a few minutes. The next time you notice yourself comparing your life to someone else's, pause and ask yourself one question. What specifically am I comparing? And is this actually something within my control? Often you will find you are comparing outcomes, things like income, appearance, or recognition, none of which fully reflect effort or character. Then ask a second question. What is one thing, today, that reflects the kind of person I am trying to become, regardless of anyone else's results? This works because it interrupts the automatic comparison loop and redirects your attention towards something you can actually act on. Comparison is passive. It happens to you. This exercise puts you back in the position of author rather than spectator of your own life. Even a single honest repetition of this exercise can noticeably loosen the grip of a comparison that felt inescapable only moments before. A second version of this exercise works well for larger, recurring comparisons rather than passing moments, things like career trajectory or life stage rather than a single meeting or photograph. Take a sheet of paper and draw 2 columns. In the first, list what you are actually comparing, stripped of any story around it, simply the facts. In the second column, list what you know about your own effort, circumstances, and history that the comparison conveniently leaves out, things like when you started, what obstacles you faced that the other person did not, and what you were doing during the years they were building whatever you are admiring or resenting. This is not an exercise in manufacturing excuses. It is an exercise in honesty, since most comparisons are built on incomplete information, comparing your full, complicated story to someone else's highlight reel. To make this lasting, it helps to build a nightly practice around it, after in something short enough that you will actually keep doing it. But before you sleep, take out a notebook, even a simple one, and ask yourself 4 questions. First, where today did I let someone else's opinion shrink me, even slightly? Second, was that opinion actually about my character, or only about my circumstances? Third, what did I do today that reflected genuine effort, regardless of whether anyone noticed it? Fourth, if no one were watching or judging tomorrow, what would I choose to focus on? These questions are not meant to produce guilt. They are meant to produce awareness. Over weeks, you will likely notice a pattern. The moments that felt like failures were rarely about your actual character, and the moments that felt meaningful were rarely about outperforming someone else. Written down over time, these small nightly answers begin to form an honest record of who you actually are, separate from the version of you that comparison keeps trying to invent. There is a deeper root to this entire struggle, one that most people rarely examine directly. Comparison persists not because we genuinely believe other people are more deserving of respect, but because somewhere along the way we were taught that our worth had to be earned through winning, A parent who only praised results and never effort. A school system built entirely around ranking. A culture that constantly displays the highlights of other people's lives while hiding their struggles. None of this was your fault, and none of it reflects the truth about you. But it quietly trained your mind to treat existence itself as a competition, when in reality, a sense of worth that has to be constantly re-earned through comparison was never stable to begin with. Real self-respect does not need a scoreboard. It exists whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not you are winning anything at all. It was there before the comparison started, and it remains there long after you stop keeping score. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why achievement alone rarely resolves the feeling of not being enough. If the underlying belief is that worth must be earned through winning, then every achievement only buys temporary relief before the mind resets and looks for the next comparison to win. People who reach genuinely remarkable levels of success often describe this exact experience, a nagging sense that the goalposts keep moving no matter how far they travel. The problem was never a lack of achievement. It was a foundation built on the wrong premise from the very beginning, one that no amount of winning was ever going to repair, because the scoreboard itself was the flaw, not your position on it. It is worth pausing here to correct a common misunderstanding. One, believing that no one is better than you, in the way this video means it, does not mean believing you are flawless, or that you have nothing left to learn, or that other people's skills and achievements do not matter. That would simply be arrogance, dressed up in different language. And arrogance is its own kind of insecurity, desperately trying to prove something to an audience it secretly fears will not be convinced. What is actually being suggested is different. It means recognizing that your fundamental dignity as a person is not up for negotiation based on rankings. You can admire someone's talent, learn from their discipline, even wish you had their circumstances, while still knowing that none of that makes them a more worthy human being than you. Confidence rooted in calm self-respect looks almost nothing like the loud confidence often mistaken for it. It is quiet. It does not need an audience, and it does not need to convince anyone of anything, including itself. This inner steadiness is not only a mental discipline, it shows up in the body as well. When people feel small in comparison to others, they often physically shrink, shoulders rounding forward, breath becoming shallow, eyes dropping to the floor. Something as simple as noticing your posture during the day, gently lengthening your spine, unclenching your jaw, taking a few slower breaths, can quietly signal to your nervous system that you are safe and steady, regardless of what is happening around you. A short walk outside, especially without your phone, can also help interrupt the comparison loop, since much of it is fed by scrolling through curated glimpses of other people's lives. Even the simple act of setting your phone in another room for an hour each evening can noticeably lower the number of comparisons your mind makes in a day. None of this replaces the inner work, but the body and mind are deeply connected. This and small physical shifts often make emotional steadiness easier to access. Sleep deserves particular attention here, since a tired mind is far more likely to default to comparison and self-criticism than a rested one. When you are exhausted, your mind has fewer resources available for the kind of reflective thinking this practice requires, and it tends to fall back on old, automatic patterns instead. Something as simple as protecting a consistent bedtime, keeping the room dark, and giving yourself a short wind-down period without screens can noticeably improve how steady you feel the next day when comparison inevitably arises. None of this is a medical prescription, only a practical observation. A well-rested body tends to produce a calmer, more resilient mind, and a calmer mind is far better equipped to remember what actually matters. When you bring all of this together, a complete way of thinking begins to form. First, you recognize that comparison is an old survival instinct, not a reliable measure of your worth, and that your mind is simply running an ancient program in an environment it was never designed for. Then, you separate what is within your control, your effort, your character, your response, from what is not, other people's opinions, achievements, and circumstances. Next, you interrupt the automatic comparison loop in the moment it happens, redirecting your attention toward your own growth rather than someone else's results. And after that, you build a nightly practice of honest reflection, not to judge yourself, but to notice patterns and gently correct them over time. And finally, you support this inner shift with small physical habits, posture, breath, movement, that help your body feel as steady as your mind is learning to become. None of these steps require you to defeat anyone, They only require you to stop measuring yourself against a scoreboard that was never real to begin with, and that no philosopher worth listening to ever asked you to keep. Notice, too, that each of these steps reinforces the others rather than standing alone. Recognizing the old instinct makes it easier to separate what is yours to control. Separating what is yours to control makes the nightly reflection more honest, because you are no longer grading yourself against outcomes you never owned in the first place. That honest reflection, repeated over weeks, gradually reshapes the automatic story your mind tells about your own worth. And the physical habits, the posture, the breath, the rest, give that new story somewhere steady to live, so it does not get undone the moment you are tired or overwhelmed. None of these pieces work quickly in isolation. Together, repeated patiently, they form something durable, a way of moving through the world, that no longer depends on where you happen to rank on any given day. There is one more thing worth saying plainly, because it is easy to miss in a video like this. None of this asks you to stop caring about other people, admiring their strengths, or celebrating their successes. A person who has genuinely stopped comparing is often more generous toward others, not less, because their sense of worth no longer depends on someone else falling short. When a friend succeeds, it costs you nothing, because your value was never measured against theirs to begin with. This is, in a strange way, the most practical benefit of everything discussed here. Letting go of comparison does not just protect your own peace. It quietly repairs your relationships, because you are finally able to show up for other people, without a hidden scoreboard running in the background of every interaction. None of this changes overnight, and it would be dishonest to promise that it would. Old habits of comparison were built over years, often decades, and they will not dissolve after a single video or a single night of reflection. But you can begin tonight, in a small and honest way. The next time that quiet voice starts ranking you against someone else, you do not need to argue with it or silence it. You simply need to notice it, and gently remind yourself that your worth was never something anyone else was qualified to calculate. You are not required to be better than anyone. You are only required to keep becoming more fully yourself, one honest day at a time. And if you can hold on to that one idea, letting it settle slowly rather than forcing it, everything else in this practice will follow naturally, the way steadiness always tends to follow patience. If this way of thinking spoke to something in you, consider staying a little longer, because there is another video waiting that continues this same thread of thought, exploring how the ancient philosophers faced adversity without losing their inner calm. Subscribing helps this kind of quiet, reflective philosophy keep reaching people who need it, one evening at a time. Wherever you are watching this from, thank you for spending this time turning inward instead of outward, even for a little while.